It was 12:02 in the morning on July 30th, 1945, and the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was cutting through the Philippine Sea with her running lights dark. 2 miles below the surface of sleep, most of her 1,195 men were racked out in their bunks. Then the first torpedo hit the bow, and the second tore into her fuel tanks and powder magazine near midship. The explosion threw a column of fire 200 feet into the black sky, and men were knocked out of their bunks and off their feet on decks that were already starting to tilt. Within 4 minutes, the bow was underwater and the ship was rolling onto her side. Men slid down steel decks that had become steel walls, grabbing for lines, for railings, for each other. Some went down with compartments that flooded before they could climb out. By 12:14, 12 minutes after the first hit, Indianapolis was gone, and close to 900 men were floating in the dark, oil-slicked water, with no life rafts to speak of and no one on shore expecting them for 4 more days. Of those 900, only 316 would still be alive when rescue finally came. The rest were lost to the water itself, to thirst, to the sun, and to something in the water with them. This is a story the United States Navy did not advertise. It broke within days of Hiroshima, and the country barely noticed it at the time. But, for the men who lived through it, 4 days and 5 hours in the open ocean, it never really ended. To understand how they got there, we have to go back 2 weeks, to a secret crate loaded onto a dock in San Francisco. On July 16, 1945, Captain Charles McVay stood on the deck of Indianapolis at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco and watched 2 crates come aboard under armed Marine Guard. He was 46 years old, a Naval Academy man, son of an admiral, and he had not been told what was inside them. He only knew the orders: sail fast, sail alone, and ask no questions. One crate held the uranium core of a weapon that did not yet have a name outside a handful of scientists. The other held its firing mechanism. Below decks, Lieutenant Commander Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, noticed the same thing every sailor noticed that week. Indianapolis smelled like fresh paint. She had new guns bolted to her deck and a coat of gray that hadn't seen salt spray yet. At 33, Haynes had patched up burns and broken bones for years, but he had never seen the ship looking this sharp, and it made the crew feel, for a few days at least, like they were sailing something invincible. 19-year-old Seaman Cox felt it too. He'd been assigned an orange kapok life jacket back in training, the kind stuffed with kapok fiber that kept a man's head above water, and he'd worn it in drills so many times it had become background noise, a piece of gear nobody thought twice about. He kept his dog tags looped through his undershirt and his letters from home tucked in his locker, and like most of the crew, he had no idea the ship was carrying anything more dangerous than depth charges. The run from San Francisco to Tinian Island in the Marianas took 10 days, and Indianapolis set a speed record doing it, refueling once at Pearl Harbor without slowing the pace. She arrived at Tinian on July 26 and unloaded her cargo onto the dock in under an hour. No one aboard was told what the crates contained, only that the mission was finished, and that a great many lives, they were told, now depended on the 2 boxes reaching the runway safely. It would be a little over a week before the world learned the name of that cargo, Little Boy. Captain McVay had received orders that made the danger plain, even without details. Naval Academy records preserve the tone of his standing instructions from command: proceed to Tinian, at best possible speed. No escort was assigned. No submarine threat briefing came with the route from Guam to Leyte. McVay would later tell the court that marshaled him he had simply followed the intelligence he was given. And that intelligence that July had nothing to say about I-58. With the bomb delivered, Indianapolis turned toward Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, ordered to join the battleship USS Idaho for gunnery training ahead of the planned invasion of Japan. She sailed alone. No destroyer screen, no escort ships, just one heavy cruiser crossing 600 miles of open Pacific on a route Navy intelligence had rated as low risk. It was a judgment that would prove to be badly, fatally wrong. On the night of July 29, the sea was overcast with patches of moonlight breaking through low clouds. Visibility came and went in stretches of a few hundred yards. Captain McVay weighed the standing doctrine that zigzagging saved fuel and time when the risk of submarines was judged low, and with no specific warning on his route, he gave the order to steam a straight course through the night. It was a decision made by the book, using the information he had. Down in sick bay, Dr. Haynes had already started a small habit that would matter more than he knew. He carried a canvas pouch for personal effects gathered from the badly injured and, on occasion, the dead. Dog tags mostly, a wedding ring once, a photograph. It never held more than a few items at a time. There was no reason yet to think that pouch would ever need to hold more than that. That same night, 11:35, a lookout aboard the Japanese submarine I-58 spotted a dark shape on the moonlit horizon. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto brought his boat around for a firing solution on a target he could not yet identify. A lone ship running without escort, without zigzag, exactly where naval doctrine said no enemy submarine should be waiting. 27 minutes later, at 4 minutes past midnight, he gave the order to fire. Hours before the ocean turned against them, Seaman Harold Bray had looked the ship over with something close to pride. The ship was looking good, he said. New paint, some new guns. It was a very exciting time. By midnight, the cruiser he was praising, freshly painted and freshly armed, would be a coffin for hundreds of the men standing near him on that deck. The night of July 29 came in overcast, low clouds sliding across a half moon that showed itself in patches and then vanished for minutes at a time. Visibility on the bridge ran a few hundred yards at best. Standing Navy doctrine held that zigzagging burned fuel and time a captain could not always spare, and that the maneuver mattered most when submarine activity was rated high. Indianapolis had received no specific warning for this stretch of water. Weighing the doctrine against the darkness, Captain McVay gave the order to secure the zigzag and hold a straight course through the night. It was a decision made strictly by the book, using the intelligence he had been given on a route Navy planners had rated low risk. Down the length of the ship, watch changed, men not on duty turned in for the night, and Indianapolis ran on alone unescorted, 400 miles from the nearest friendly vessel. At 11:35, a lookout aboard the Japanese submarine I-58 caught a dark shape breaking the moonlight on the horizon. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto came to the periscope himself. He could not yet identify the silhouette, only that it was large, alone, running without escort and without the zigzag pattern American doctrine usually called for. He ordered his boat brought around to close the range and set up a firing solution. 27 minutes later, at 4 minutes past midnight, Hashimoto gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes left I-58's tubes at 3-second intervals, closing on Indianapolis from roughly 1,500 yards out. On the cruiser's bridge, no lookout had reported a periscope, no sonar contact had sounded an alarm. The first anyone aboard knew of the attack was the moment the torpedoes arrived. It is 12:02 in the morning. 2 torpedoes strike Indianapolis's starboard side within seconds of each other, one forward near the bow, one amidships close to a fuel tank and a powder magazine. The second explosion lifts men off their feet 300 feet away. The ship that had carried the atomic bomb to Tinian without incident, that had never once been struck in nearly 3 years of war, begins in an instant to die. The amidships blast tore through berthing compartments where men were sleeping, killing dozens before they ever woke. Fire spread along exposed fuel lines. Power failed across most of the ship within the first minute, plunging passageways below decks into total darkness broken only by flame. Men who had been asleep an hour earlier now felt the deck tilting hard beneath their bare feet and understood, before anyone said a word, that the ship was going down. In the radio room, operators fought to get a distress call out on backup power before the transmitters failed entirely. Later investigation would confirm that at least one SOS did leave the ship, but no acknowledgement came back over the air that night, and nothing about Indianapolis's silence would trouble anyone on shore for days. The men sending that signal had no way of knowing it was already being met with silence. Below decks, watertight doors that should have contained the flooding had been left open in the tropical heat for ventilation, standard practice on a hot Pacific crossing. Seawater poured through passageways never designed to hold it back. Men trapped in lower compartments pounded on bulkheads that would not open. Within 4 minutes of the first hit, the ship was already listing hard enough that walking upright had become impossible. On the bridge, Captain McVay was thrown into the water when a wave broke over the rail. He would spend the rest of the night in a life jacket among his own crew. The order to abandon ship was passed by voice, deck to deck, because the ship's announcing system had died with the power. Some men never heard it at all. They simply felt the deck disappear from under them and went into the water because there was nothing left to stand on. Seaman Cox had been asleep when the first blast threw him from his rack. By the time he reached the deck, Indianapolis was already listing more than 45 degrees. The steel underfoot slick with fuel oil and impossible to grip. He lost his footing twice climbing toward the rail. When the ship rolled harder, he simply let go, sliding down the barnacled hull and into black water already thick with oil and screaming men. The ship rolled onto her side, hung there for a long moment, and then went down by the bow, her screws still turning as the stern lifted clear of the water. It is 12:14 in the morning. 12 minutes have passed since the first torpedo struck. Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser that had steamed more than 100,000 miles across a world war without ever losing a man to enemy fire, is gone. What remained on the surface was fuel oil spreading in a slick that stretched for hundreds of yards, and men, hundreds of them, scattered across the dark water calling names into the night. Some clung to the few rafts that had broken free. Most had only their kapok life jackets and each other. Below them, in compartments that had never opened, several hundred more had gone down with the ship. Dr. Haynes surfaced coughing fuel oil, his medical kit lost somewhere on the ship he'd just left. Within the first hour, men were already finding him in the dark, calling out for the doctor, and he began doing the only medicine the ocean allowed, checking pulses by touch, tying the badly hurt to anything that floated, and telling the men nearest him to conserve their strength for daylight when they could organize. By first light, nearly 900 men were spread across the water in loose, drifting groups, some within shouting distance of each other, many entirely alone. Of the 1,196 who had sailed from Guam, roughly 300 were already dead, most of them below decks in the first minutes, before most of the survivors had even reached the rail. No raft carried more than a handful of men. Fresh water existed nowhere within 400 miles, and not one of the men treading water that first morning had any reason to believe help was coming soon because, as far as the United States Navy's own records were concerned, Indianapolis was not overdue. She was simply not expected to arrive anywhere for 2 more days. That silence, more than the torpedoes, would decide how many of them lived. Nearly 900 men now floated in open ocean with no one ashore watching a clock for their arrival. The ship was gone in 12 minutes. What came next would take 4 days, and for many of the men bobbing in that oil slick at dawn, it would prove far harder to survive than the sinking itself. The policy had a name, though no one treading water that morning knew it. Combatant ships like Indianapolis were not required to file arrival reports, and no one was required to notice if they failed to show up. A cruiser could vanish from the ocean, and for 2 full days, not a single desk in the entire United States Navy would be short one signature to raise an alarm. Dr. Haynes moved between the nearest clusters as the light strengthened, doing what triage he could without a kit. He checked pulses by pressing 2 fingers to a man's throat, tied the unconscious to floating wreckage with anything that would hold a knot, and told the able-bodied to link arms and kapok straps so no one drifted off alone in the night that was still 10 hours away. By mid-morning, the math of the life jackets had become unavoidable. Some men had 2 stripped from friends who had not survived the first hours. Others had none, their kapok lost in the scramble off the sinking ship. Haynes began the grim redistribution himself, pulling jackets from the dead before the current could take them, and passing them, without ceremony, to the living. Seaman Cox, 19 and still gripping the edge of the largest raft cluster, made a decision no officer had told him to make. When 2 smaller groups drifted close enough to shout, he talked them into lashing their jackets and belts together rather than paddling on alone. That single choice, made by a teenager with no rank to speak of, would keep more than 60 men within reach of one another for the next 4 days. 300 miles away, radio operators at 3 separate stations logged distress signals that night. One watch officer was reportedly drunk, another had been ordered not to disturb his commander. A third assumed the message was a Japanese trick. All 3 signals were filed and none was acted on. Indianapolis had cried out into the dark and the Navy had simply not been listening. The sun came up hard on the first full day, and by 9 o'clock the fuel oil coating their skin had begun to blister where it caught the light. There was no shade anywhere in 400 miles of open Pacific. Lips cracked white at the corners, tongues swelled against the roofs of dry mouths, and men who had been Navy sailors 12 hours earlier began quietly to become something closer to castaways. By afternoon, some of the men were pointing at the horizon, certain they saw land. Others swore they could feel a freshwater spring bubbling up from below, cool against their legs if they only dove deep enough. Haynes had seen this before in training lectures on saltwater exposure, but seeing the words on a page and watching a friend swim toward an island that was not there were two very different things. One small group grew convinced that Indianapolis had not sunk at all, only settled a few fathoms down, and that if they swam hard enough they would find her galley still lit, still serving hot food to whoever knocked on the hull. 3 men swam off after that ship. None of the 3 came back, and the men who stayed behind stopped mentioning it after that. Night brought no mercy. The equatorial sun that scorched them by day gave way to water cold enough to drop a man's core temperature toward 88 degrees before dawn, close to the edge of hypothermic coma. Their kapok jackets, soaked for 18 hours straight, had begun to lose the buoyancy that had kept them afloat, and men who could barely feel their hands now had to fight the ocean just to stay on the surface. Thirst did what 4 days of rationing never could have. Men who had gone without fresh water for a day and a half began drinking seawater against every warning shouted at them, and within hours their eyes turned bloodshot and swollen, a sign Haynes had learned to read as a death sentence. Some grew violent. Some grew calm and glassy, smiling at nothing, before they slipped under and did not come back up. It was on the second night that the fins started. At first just one, cutting a slow gray line at the edge of a cluster, easy to mistake for a trick of the moonlight. By the next morning there were a dozen, then 2 dozen, circling the loose rafts and the men strung together by belts and jacket straps, patient in a way that made the waiting worse than any single attack. Lowell Dean Cox was 19 and treading water an arm's length from a friend when it happened. Every now and then, like lightning, one would come straight up and take a sailor and take him straight down. One came up and took the sailor next to me. It was just somebody screaming, yelling, or getting bit. Cox never learned the man's name. He never stopped remembering the sound. There was no ceremony for a death like that, no time to grieve before the next one. The men nearest simply closed the gap in the line, said whatever prayer they had left in them, and kept their eyes on the water instead of the empty space beside them. By the 3rd night, the sound of a scream cutting off mid-breath had stopped being unusual. It had simply become part of the dark. Haynes kept a private count no officer had ordered him to keep. Each time a man died in his arms, he recited what he remembered of the Lord's Prayer, pulled the dog tags free and slid them onto a growing loop around his own wrist and fist. By the 3rd day there were too many tags to hold, cutting into his palm with every stroke, and still he would not let a single name go under unrecorded. Not every hour was horror. On the 2nd night, a group near the center of Cox's cluster began singing, low and off-key, hymns half remembered from Sunday services on the ship. Others joined in from clusters too far to see, just voices carrying over black water. For a few minutes, men who could not feel their own legs anymore sang together, and it was, several of them said later, the only thing that felt like home. By the dawn of the 4th day, the singing had mostly stopped, the fins had not. Somewhere above the clouds, a routine patrol plane with a broken antenna was already in the air, its pilot annoyed at the malfunction slowing him down, with no idea that 900 miles of empty ocean below him held the last chance nearly 900 men would ever get. At 9:10 in the morning on August 2, Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn banked his PV-1 Ventura on a routine anti-submarine patrol out of Peleliu, 4 days after Indianapolis had gone down without a single distress call ever reaching anyone who acted on it. A trailing radio antenna had jammed somewhere behind the tail, and Gwynn, mildly irritated, dropped low to see if he could work it free by hand through the belly hatch. It was a mechanic's problem, not a rescue mission. Nobody aboard expected to find anything at all that morning, least of all this. At 11:18, with the antenna still tangled, Gwyn happened to glance down and saw a long silver-brown stain spreading across the blue water, miles wide, the unmistakable sheen of leaking fuel oil. His first thought was a surfaced enemy submarine, and he radioed a possible sighting before banking down for a closer look. Then he saw what the slick actually held. Dozens, then what looked like hundreds, of small dark shapes scattered across open ocean, some bobbing and moving, most of them simply still. He circled twice to be certain his eyes were not lying to him, then broke radio silence with a message that would reach 3 different commands within the hour. Many men in the water, position confirmed, request immediate air-sea rescue. Down below, Cox lifted his head at the sound of an engine that did not belong to any Japanese aircraft he recognized. For 4 days, the sky had offered nothing but sun, cloud, and circling fins. This time it offered noise, and the noise did not go away. Within the hour, seaplanes and surface ships across a wide stretch of the Philippine Sea were ordered to Gwyn's coordinates, though almost no one receiving the order yet understood what ship the men had come from. Word reached McVay's scattered group of officers nearly an hour later, carried man-to-man across open water and shouted relays. McVay raised the binoculars still hanging, salt-crusted, around his neck, and for the first time since the torpedoes struck, searched the horizon for something other than sharks. By early afternoon, the first rescue aircraft reached the survivors, dropping rubber rafts, spare life jackets, and cans of drinking water into the scattered clusters below. Men who had not moved in hours found the strength to swim toward the splashes. Haynes, the dog tags cutting a raw groove into his wrist, watched one raft drift close enough to reach and pulled 2 of the worst-off sailors onto it before letting himself be hauled up last, the way he had been operating for 4 straight days. Among the aircraft answering Gwyn's call was a PBY-5A Catalina flown by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, a slow, boxy seaplane nicknamed Dumbo for its rescue work. Standing orders forbade open-sea landings in anything but calm water, since a Catalina's hull could crack against even moderate swells and strand its own crew alongside the men it had come to save. Marks looked down at bodies being circled by fins in real time, and decided the order was not written for what he was looking at. Below Marks's wing survivor, Woody James later described exactly what a rescue pilot could see from 300 feet up. You'd see fins swimming around you, and every now and then you'd see a buddy kicking, fighting, and screaming, and you couldn't do anything about it. Marks had seen enough. He pushed the yoke forward. Marks set the Catalina down on open swells that afternoon, a maneuver few pilots would have attempted and fewer would have survived without cracking the hull open. It slapped hard against each wave, rivets popping along one seam, spray whiting out the windshield. He taxied straight into the thickest cluster of survivors, cut the engines, and opened the hatch to the smell of fuel oil and salt on men who had not eaten in 4 days. The nearest sailors began swimming for the plane before it had fully stopped. Marks and his crew worked the water by triage, the same grim calculus Haynes had been running on his raft for days. Men still able to swim were told to wait. Men floating limp, bleeding, or too weak to kick were hauled up first, over the wing root and through the blister hatch onto a deck already slick with oil and salt water. A shark brushed close to one sailor mid-lift, close enough that a crewman kicked hard at the water to drive it back before the man cleared the surface entirely. By the time the plane reached Cox's cluster, his Kapok life jacket had spent 4 days in salt water and had lost most of what once kept him afloat, the fibers waterlogged and heavy instead of buoyant. He was one of the men who could still kick, and one of the last pulled from that group, hauled over the wing by 2 exhausted crewmen who did not ask his name before setting him down and turning back for the next man. Cox later said he does not remember climbing aboard. He only remembers being inside. Within 2 hours, the Catalina's fuselage held every survivor it could carry, and Marks kept pulling men from the water anyway. His crew tied the newest arrivals to the wings with parachute cord and whatever else was at hand, seating them in rows along the upper surface of the aircraft, exposed to wind and spray but clear of the fins still working below. By dusk, the plane sat so heavy it could no longer fly, anchored instead in open ocean, waiting on a ship that had not yet arrived. Roughly 90 miles off, the destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle altered course toward Gwyn's coordinates the moment the report reached her, running through the night at flank speed. her captain made a decision few captains would have needed to be told to make. Rather than wait for daylight and a formal search pattern, he ordered the ship's largest searchlight pointed straight up into the clouds, a beam visible for miles, so that any survivor still awake would know help was coming before it ever arrived. Just after midnight on August 3, the Doyle reached the position and began pulling survivors from Marx's overloaded Catalina and from rafts scattered across the surrounding water. McVay's group was recovered among the last, nearly 4 days and 5 hours after the torpedoes struck. McVay still gripping the binoculars he had somehow kept through the sinking, the swimming, and every hour since. He climbed the cargo net under his own power and asked, before anything else, how many of his men had been found. By the time the last searchlights swept the water and came up empty, 316 men had been pulled from the Philippine Sea alive. Roughly 580 more, men who had survived the sinking itself, had not survived the 4 days that followed it. Haynes came aboard still wearing his loop of dog tags, too many now to count at a glance, and he would not let the burial detail take them from his wrist until every last name had been copied down by hand, in ink, so none of them could be lost twice. When the counting finally stopped, the number stood at 316 men alive out of roughly 900 who had gone into the water 4 days earlier. Of the ship's 1,195 crew, close to 880 had survived the sinking itself, only to lose the ordeal that followed it. It remains the worst single loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy, and for decades the Navy said almost nothing about how it had happened. In December 1945, 5 months after the sinking, Captain McVay stood before a court-martial in Washington and was convicted of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag on the night it was torpedoed. He remains, to this day, the only United States Navy captain ever court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action in wartime. Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto, the man who had fired the torpedoes, was brought from Japan to testify that zigzagging would not have saved the ship. The court convicted McVay anyway. Years later, families of the dead were still mailing their grief to the man they blamed. Among the letters McVay kept was one that read in part, "Merry Christmas. Our family's holiday will always have an empty chair because of you." He answered what letters he could in his own hand and kept the rest in a drawer. On November 6, 1968, McVay took his own life on the steps of his Litchfield, Connecticut home, a Navy man's revolver in one hand and a toy sailor figurine, his grandson's, tucked in the other. The full truth took another 32 years to reach Congress. In October 2000, lawmakers passed a resolution exonerating McVay, and President Bill Clinton signed it into law. Mochitsuru Hashimoto, the submarine commander who had fired the fatal torpedoes, had by then become a Shinto priest, and before his own death that same year, he sent a letter of support for the effort, stating plainly that no captain could have avoided what happened that night. Part of why the story faded is simple timing. Indianapolis went down on July 30th, 1945. 9 days later, the atomic bomb she had delivered to Tinian fell on Hiroshima, and the front pages of every newspaper in the country turned to that instead. The ship that carried the weapon that helped end the war became, in the public memory, a footnote to the very mission that killed most of her crew, and the Navy's own silence about missed distress calls and unread arrival logs was never forced into daylight. Lowell Dean Cox lived into his 90s, and by his own account, the water never fully let him go. At the survivors' reunions he attended for decades, he said he came partly to see the faces from his dreams, the same men, the same ocean, the same search that never quite ended when he woke. "I suppose that means I'm back in the water again," he said once, "looking for someone on my team." Most people who know sharks in the open ocean only from a 1975 movie have never heard where that fear actually came from. A single line of dialogue borrowed from a real man's memory of 4 days adrift. Had you heard the name Indianapolis before Jaws made sharks famous, or is this the first time the two stories have come together for you? 316 men came home. The rest are still counted, name by name on a wall in Indianapolis, Indiana, where the tide never reaches. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, went back to practicing medicine after the war and lived into his 90s. In the water he had done what he could with nothing, tying life jackets under men's arms, saying the Lord's Prayer over bodies before letting them go. He rarely spoke publicly about those days for decades. When he finally did in oral history interviews late in life, he said the hardest part was not the sharks but deciding, hour by hour, which men still had a chance and which did not. Woody James, who had lost 66 pounds and could neither walk nor speak by the time the rescue boats reached him, spent months recovering in Navy hospitals before going home to Louisiana. He carried the scars from saltwater ulcers on his throat for the rest of his life. In later interviews, he described the delirium that swept through groups of men in the water, how thirst and salt poisoning made some drink seawater and turn on their own shipmates, mistaking them for enemies. Giles McCoy, a Marine private who survived the sharks and the drifting, became one of the loudest voices demanding the Navy admit what it had gotten wrong. For years he wrote letters, gave interviews, and pressed lawmakers, insisting that Charles McVay had been made a scapegoat for failures that reached far above one captain's cabin. He would live to see the exoneration resolution pass in 2000, one of the last survivors still fighting for it. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, the pilot whose antenna problem sent him off course on August 2, went on with an ordinary flying career and rarely gave interviews about the discovery. For years his name barely appeared in newspaper accounts of the rescue, overshadowed by the more dramatic image of Adrian Marks landing his Catalina among the sharks. Without that broken antenna, though, no one on any patrol route was likely to notice an oil slick and a scatter of heads in 600,000 square miles of open Pacific. Adrian Marks, the Catalina pilot who defied standing orders and set his plane down in open ocean, was initially expected to face discipline for the landing. Instead, the Navy credited him with saving dozens of lives, and he was awarded the Navy Cross. His flying boat was so overloaded with survivors lashed to its wings by the end of the day that it could no longer take off. The crew scuttled it themselves after the destroyer escorts arrived and took the men aboard. Captain McVay was not simply reprimanded. In December 1945, less than 5 months after the sinking, he stood before a court-martial board in Washington and was convicted of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag on a moonlit night. Mochitsura Hashimoto himself testified for the defense, through an interpreter, that zigzagging would have made no difference to his aim that night. The board convicted McVay anyway. The only United States Navy captain court-martialed for losing a ship to enemy action in the entire war. The conviction effectively ended McVay's career. He was reassigned to a shore post in New Orleans and retired in 1949 with the rank of Rear Admiral, a promotion given largely as a courtesy on the way out. For years afterward, families of men who had died in the water sent him letters blaming him personally, some at Christmas, some on the anniversary of the sinking. He kept a small toy sailor on his desk, a gift from one of his own children, long after the letters started arriving. On November 6, 1968, Charles McVay was found dead at his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, having taken his own life. He was 70 years old. Survivors who had served under him were, by most accounts, devastated and angry, feeling that the Navy's judgment had finally taken the one life it had spent 23 years trying to break. It would take another 3 decades before Congress moved to clear his name. The turning point came from an unlikely source. In 1996, an 11-year-old Florida schoolboy named Hunter Scott chose the Indianapolis for a National History Day project, tracked down and interviewed more than 150 survivors, and testified before Congress about what he had learned. His research helped reopen a case the Navy itself had closed for half a century, and it put surviving crewmen back in front of the cameras for the first time in years. On October 30, 2000, both houses of Congress passed a resolution stating that Charles McVay's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of Indianapolis, and President Bill Clinton signed it. The Navy's own official record was not changed in every particular, but the moral verdict delivered by lawmakers and by the survivors who had fought for it was clear. McVay's family accepted the resolution on his behalf, 32 years after his death. Part of why so few Americans know this story is the calendar. 9 days after Indianapolis went down, the bomb components she had delivered helped end the war over Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki, and the surrender that followed on August 15 filled every front page for weeks. A disaster that killed roughly 600 men in the water was, in the public mind of that August, absorbed into a much larger story of victory and relief. There was also the matter of what the Navy did not want examined too closely. Investigators later found that at least 3 separate stations had received distress signals from Indianapolis that night and did nothing, one officer reportedly drunk, another understanding orders not to disturb his commander, a third assuming it was a Japanese decoy. None of those failures were ever prosecuted. The court-martial of one captain closed the book on a story the institution preferred not to reopen. Today, a memorial stands in downtown Indianapolis, Indiana, on the banks of the White River, engraved with the names of every man who served aboard the ship, survivors and lost alike. Families still travel there each July for a reunion of descendants, since the last known survivors have now passed. Divers located the wreck itself in 2017, resting more than 3 miles down in the Philippine Sea, largely intact, a discovery funded by a Microsoft co-founder with a private research vessel. The wreck's discovery answered questions the survivors had carried for 72 years, confirming the location and the speed of the sinking exactly as they had described it. Navy divers and historians who examined the sonar images noted the twisted bow section lying apart from the hull, evidence of the torpedo strike that doomed the ship in minutes. For the handful of survivors still living in 2017, the news brought something closer to peace than closure. What stays with people who study this story is not only the sharks, though that part is true and it was as bad as the movie line suggested. It is the 4 days of decisions made by ordinary men with almost nothing. Doctors rationing hope instead of medicine, sailors giving up their own life jackets, a pilot breaking orders because leaving men in the water felt worse than any punishment waiting for him back at base. It is also a story about how institutions protect themselves and how long it can take for the truth to catch up with the men who paid for someone else's failure. Charles McVay did not live to hear Congress clear his name. Most of the men he commanded did not live to see the wreck found. The story survived because a handful of people, an 11-year-old with a school project, a Marine private who would not stop writing letters, refused to let it disappear. Had you heard the name Indianapolis before a line in a 1975 movie made sharks famous? Or is this the first time you have heard where that fear really came from? If you know a veteran or a family member connected to this ship or to any ship lost the same way, its story is worth telling before it fades the way this one nearly did. 316 men came home from 4 days in the Philippine Sea. Charles McVay carried the weight of that voyage for 23 years before it finally broke him, and it took the country another 32 years after his death to admit he had never deserved to carry it alone. The names of everyone who served aboard Indianapolis are cut into stone in the city that shares her name, and the tide, 600 miles from where she sank, never reaches them at all.